My name's James McCauley, and you're watching AccessTV.org.
Good morning. You know, it's been said that you get a blessing every day, but my blessing today is meeting Professor Jack Dougherty from Trinity College's Urban Studies program. Professor, we spoke on the phone, welcome to the show, some months ago, and I expressed to you that I received excerpts of your study, you as author and your colleagues from Trinity, on the subject of North Hartford. I believe the study is called On the Line, How Housing, Schooling, and
Civil Rights
Shaped Hartford and the Suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting study. Haven't seen, in my 45 years of working in the community, in the areas of community economic development, haven't seen a study as substantive as yours. The thing that struck me was that the detail, and to be specific, it was the mapping that you and your colleagues put into the study. I'm curious to know how the project came about. What has been the reaction from people who have actually read and processed your study? And where do you think we could go from here? Because of the fact that the study has been put on the airwaves, it's been put in print, and sort of gives people a roadmap who's, been curious about, well, how did Hartford turn out to be one of the most impoverished communities, North Hartford, Connecticut, I'm sorry, let me be specific, how it turned out to be one of the most impoverished communities in the state of Connecticut, when the state of Connecticut is the highest per capita income. I thought, well, it's near the top five.
Yeah.
How did this happen? Who was the brainchild of your project, and what was the reaction that you got? I'm pretty sure, I just gave you a phone call, but I'm pretty sure a lot of people came clamoring to your office trying to get some study time with you about the project. So,
Sure. Charles, thanks for asking me to sit down with you today. It's I always appreciate whenever anybody works on a project and other people take interest in it. It must be meaningful. So I've been working with a number of colleagues over the past several years on this free book on the web we're writing called On the Line, and you can actually look at it at ontheline.trincol, like Trinity College, TRINCOLL .edu. So On the Line, it's we're writing this book. We aren't done with it yet, but we're putting together these chapters on the web that are trying to explain a story about how these lines came about inside the city of Hartford and between the cities and the suburbs that shaped over the past several hundred years how we got to today, how we got to the massive inequality and racial divides that exist today between residents of the metropolitan Hartford area. I teach educational studies at Trinity College, and I'm fortunate to work with a number of really smart people who do urban studies, who do computer mapping, and a number of Trinity College students and community partners to try to tell this story of these lines that divide us all up. We've got, in addition to sort of like the boundaries between the city and the suburb, we've got school attendance lines that divide us up, school district boundaries, school attendance boundaries. And then on the housing side, we've got the color line that's shifted and changed over time. We've got zoning lines that dictate what size of homes need to be built here and there. So simply, we're trying to tell a story about these lines. And the best way we thought we could do it was put the text of the book on the web for free and embed these maps inside the book so that people can actually see these lines that have divided us. And also learn more about the activists who over time have been trying to either step over the lines, march over the lines, redraw the lines, or erase the lines. That's the story we think needs to be told.
Very interesting that you would say that. And you mentioned earlier about the hundreds of years that these conditions have existed, because the whole notion, probably throughout the United States, because of the civil unrest when Dr. Martin Luther King got assassinated, which we just celebrated his birthday last week. The conditions came from the rioting and things of that nature, but I know personally, in my 45 years of trying to get the city to kind of like quell this project that's been going on, you know, in North Hartford, unbeknownst to me until I really started reading and hearing different things, it's my understanding that these things started, the conditions really started in the 1930s. And I know a prominent couple, and their sons have become very prominent public servants in our community, also tried to do the same work that we took on after they went on, because my parents knew the folk that were being pretty much vilified for what they were trying to do. So that pretty much dispels the notion or the misconception that the conditions that exist in urban America, because I don't think that the conditions are just strictly in North Hartford, Connecticut. In fact, I know for a fact they're not, because I've been in the business of community economic development for 45 years, and I have colleagues in different parts of the United States. So the mapping that you and your colleagues were able to share with us pretty much validates what we were saying. This has been a systemic project by whomever, and nobody knows who the perpetrators are, or the bishops who claim to be the king. And we're not trying to point the fingers, because we don't know who we're pointing the finger at. But what was the reaction from people outside of your academic circle when they read your study and kind of like processed it, and maybe came to your office, emailed you, being curious? What was their reaction to your study?
Well, let's go back to one thing that's grabbed a lot of people's attention. I think grabbed your attention. It's this 1930s redlining map, and people didn't really know about these things until a lot of activists in the 1960s and 70s began to find out about what the federal government and a lot of private lenders and banks were doing back in the 1930s during the Depression. And no one in Hartford, to my knowledge, had seen one of these redlining maps until I went down to Washington, D.C., found it deep in the archives, and made a scan of it and brought it up here, and we publicized the map that exists. Organizers, community members, organizers like yourself, and nonprofit organizations like the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, they took a deep interest in this redlining map, and it's not hard to see why. It's a shocking case of what America did. So take it back here to the Depression in the 1930s. You know, even worse of a housing crisis than we just went through recently in 2008. Back in the 1930s, the federal government's trying to jumpstart this housing economy, and when you think about how they're trying to do that, is they're trying to make loans available. It was really hard to get a mortgage in the 1930s. The rates that the sort of mortgage, they call them mortgage instruments, the mortgage packages that are available now, they didn't exist like that back in the 1930s. So the Roosevelt administration is trying to get people to lend money to homeowners, and the way they do that is they send a representative of the U.S. government to meet with all the bankers in Hartford in 1937. And they sit down and they go through neighborhood by neighborhood what the federal government and the private bankers think is going to be a good loan area versus a risky loan area. And they literally made this color-coded map. And the colors, you can see them, it's green, blue, yellow, and red. Green's seen as the best place to invest your money if you're a banker, and red is seen as the riskiest area. Now, if people were just making a map of loans based on, maybe the price of the house, or whether it's a brick house or a wood house, or whether it's got a decent foundation, that would be one thing. But we also found with the map about 30, 40 pages of details about each neighborhood. And when you look at the details, which we posted in our online version of the map as well, anybody can see it at ontheline.trincal.edu, the redlining map shows that the federal government and the bankers together looked at not just the physical property and the dollar price of it, but who lived there. Were there immigrants living there? Were there, in language of the times in the 1930s, were there Negroes living there? Were there families on relief, which is 1930s language for welfare or family, direct assistance to families? And the people who put together the redlining map, they would write in details, and we have some of these online where they'd say clearly, well, this is not a good area to loan to because there's Negroes moving in, or there's not a good area to loan to because there's too many Hebrews, referring to Jews, moving into this area, or talking about different people by the immigrant status or something like this. So we've been surprised looking at this redlining map it covers West Hartford and Hartford, and there's another map that goes with it that covers East Hartford. The red areas on the map clearly are showing that the bankers didn't, and the federal government weren't going to encourage loans to people who lived right up close to the Connecticut River, especially right in the immediate northeast end, the neighborhoods you're most concerned about.
Yeah.
But I think it's what's striking over time is that the entire city of Hartford was not redlined back in the 30s. In fact, there's large pieces of Hartford, the city, that had the green indication. The northwest area at that time, and what we call the West End today, high rating, and then nearby West Hartford. People think of that as a wealthy suburb today. There's parts of West Hartford that in the 1930s had a lower rating than some neighborhoods in Hartford. So the past doesn't necessarily predict exactly what the future is going to look like.
Now, was that pre-FHA and FHH, or where did the government come in and bring in these programs where I have a background in, I'm a retired federal housing official, so the FHA loans and FHH loans, where did that fit into that scenario? Was it pre or post?
This is perfect. It's right around the same time, 1930s, and really kicking in the early, late 30s, early 1940s. You've got the Homeowners Loan Corporation. That's one branch of the federal government, sort of like trying to predict where, they're trying to encourage private businesses where they should be investing money and maybe disinvesting money. And then also you've got the federal government doing the Federal Homeowners Association loans, the FHA loans that we still have today in a different form. The FHA loans, we've written about this in the On the Line book also, and this is something that happened nationally as well. FHA loans, the instructions from the federal government laid out in vivid detail, and we put little screenshots of this, of the actual documents up online. If you were living in a neighborhood that had a restrictive covenant that actually said that only whites could buy or rent homes in the neighborhood, you were much more likely to get a higher FHA rating.
Okay.
And if you were in a neighborhood that had increasing numbers of they called them at the time infiltrating groups, in the language of the time, Negroes, immigrants,
very sophisticated language.
It's written out right. It's actually it's like hundreds of pages of fine print for what they call the underwriters, the people who had to sort of certify whether or not it was going to be a good loan or not to qualify to get special reduced FHA mortgage rates.
One interesting point about Connecticut, and this lies another sophisticated way, that every town in the municipality had its own zoning board of appeals, which meant that they were in control of who moved in and who didn't move in. And the fact of the matter is that the people who were trying to keep other people out were funded by the same funding source, so to speak, as the people that were trying to come in. For instance, public housing. They had these monstrosities called public housing developments, in the hub of the urban cities.
Yep.
But they had public housing also in what we used to call the suburbs. Now the metro rings have gone closer, but they had scattered site public housing, which meant they weren't in concentration camps. They were just scattered all around, but the same funding came from the federal government's housing authorities or FHA or FHH. And so these people were brilliant. They were brilliant in terms of what their agenda was. But the interesting thing about it is this. It's like people think that this whole project was racially motivated. I surmise that it might have been racially motivated to a certain extent, because some of the people who they, tried to oppress were of the same skin tone as they were. And I say that to say it might have been anti-Semitic. But then when African Americans started to gravitate to the Jewish population and they started cohabiting it with them, I think that's when the government really poured the gas on. And I don't want to get into too much of detail about that, but I just think
no, you got
that
good questions. Yeah.
somewhere, somebody out there, they were either anti-Semitic or they was just people who hated people other than themselves.
I think you ask good questions, and let's pick up on a couple of those themes. So what else is happening in the 1940s, 30s and 40s that's setting a lot of this in motion is public housing and where it's going to get built, and who wants the public housing and who doesn't want the public housing. I think my students at Trinity, they're stunned to find out that public housing is, it's got a negative reputation in a lot of communities today, but in the 40s, 50s, there's a lot of white people standing in line to get into public housing.
Public housing was a transitional program for people who came home from the military and they needed somewhere to live.
You got a housing crisis,
you're
trying to find a place to live.
And then
exactly.
The government
Yep.
found a way through welfare, they could get transitional income from the volume of people who ended up in that system. So they took the interest from the transferable monies from welfare and whatever other giveaway programs, or that whole adage of the immigrants and the needies and things of that nature, and they made a business out of it. Then after they got what they wanted to get, they felt that these housing developments were just monstrosities. They were actually subcultures after the 40s and the 50s, and then into the 60s you had three generations of welfare families living in the same unit.
So here's a vivid example of this, and this is in the book now. One of my students and I wrote this up. It's all about debate over public housing in West Hartford in the 1940s, right around the same time as all this is happening. So here you've got the federal government saying, well, we've got the war going on, World War II, and we need to have more workers in Hartford to make munitions to fight the war.
And they have to have somewhere to live.
They got to have somewhere to live, you got it. So the federal government starts putting pressure on more places saying, we need to build wartime, federally funded public housing for war workers. And we've got munitions plants in the West Hartford border, so we need to have housing there. West Hartford local residents, white residents, go bananas. They can't stand the idea of public housing coming in because it is very much a racial threat. We have headlines from the local West Hartford paper in the 1940s saying West Hartford residents are trying to keep blacks out from moving into this public housing project. So we've got white West Hartford residents in the 1940s who are mobilizing through their local government to talk to their congressmen, to their senators, really everyone's senator, but they think of it as their senator, saying, can you get the Roosevelt administration to not put the wartime housing up? They can't prevent, the West Hartford can't prevent the housing from being built, but they managed to circumvent all the rules and come up with a way of saying that only West Hartford residents would be eligible to move into the federal funded housing. And they do the rule so that it's going to prevent any blacks from moving into the taxpayer funded wartime housing. So it's another example of something that's clearly racially motivated. West Hartford actually tears down this. This is called the Oakwood Housing Project. It's now where on Oakwood in West Hartford. Now there's a big apartment complex there now. It's not too far from the ShopRite grocery store. You can see the picture on our map. So sometimes there's direct racial motivation that's driving a lot of this. A lot of racial fear. But I think there's also a lot of greed that drives a lot of the lines and inequality that we see. And this is the other example. Zoning. Go back and figure out, well, where did this zoning thing come from? It's the sort of the right of different towns to sort of like draw lines about what size housing could be built in certain neighborhoods. So the state of Connecticut passes a law saying, okay, 169 towns, you now would give you permission to do zoning at the town level.
If you have their own zoning board of appeals.
And West Hartford is the very first out of 169 towns. West Hartford is the first to jump onto this in 1924. So we got a hold of the map and their zoning plan. And in writing, they're spelling out in the 1920s, they say, we want to create A-level areas down to B, C, D, and E-level areas. This is language in the 1920s. And they say, we want to make it so that it becomes, in their language, uneconomic to build two-family homes or houses that are really close together in the A-level areas. They write the rules so that you have to have this much land to put the house on it. And what effectively does that do? If you say there's a minimum amount of land per house, then you just up the price. And when you up the price, you exclude people from moving into that neighborhood.
The big bad wolf syndrome.
And
you live in a brick house.
You got it.
He lives in a straw house. He lives in a wood house. The house is going to stand out?
And the reason why, thank goodness we had a whole lot of civil rights activists who push for more fair housing laws to get rid of these overtly racist barriers, where the racial discrimination is written into the laws. Those have been gone since 1968 Fair Housing Act. And a lot of people are still today trying to make sure that racial discrimination is reduced in practice, because you can have it gone in writing but still have it there in practice. We know that. But the thing about the zoning that gets me is, back in the 1920s, the zoning language, it never mentions race. It's just using dollars to keep different people out.
It's the politics of economics and race,
which
in
is
urban communities.
Which lasts today because it's perfectly legal to have zoning in your town today that dictates you can only build single-family homes with huge lot sizes, which effectively going to keep out people that the upper types don't want to have.
Do you want me to maximize the cynical aspect of this whole thing?
Well, I look at it as hopeful because I think there's possible to make change when we know what's out there.
Okay,
but go ahead.
So you remember, okay, Martin Luther King got killed on April the 4th in 1968,
Yep.
and they had white flight. Okay, so supposedly all the whites left and left their properties. But guess what? They paid their mortgages 4 times over with Section 8, RAP, and what have you. Now they have a gentrification project going where those people who supposedly were white flighters, their grandsons and granddaughters are going to come back and take over the properties. And guess what? They're going to get rid of Section 8, RAP, and everything. You know what's going to happen? Gentrification. Hey, we're going to ship you out to Suffield, Berlin, Granby, and we're going to put toll booths up because you can't be able to afford to live in urban America anymore, because that's how we have it designed. So we go from the red line to gentrification, and then you have people that are orchestrating that as we speak, probably in every city in the United States, because there's one organization and one person. I don't want to mention his name. I'll just let you know that his father was the Secretary of Welfare in the Johnson administration. He goes all around the country and does these gentrification, sophisticated gentrification projects. And guess who's funding it? The business communities and the urban communities.
So I think everyone's trying to figure out what's going on today, and I certainly don't claim to know what's going on today. Certainly, I'm listening and watching like everybody else is trying to figure out, Are people getting a raw deal here when this housing development or this business development moves into this neighborhood? So I encourage everyone like you and everyone else to sort of like, we got to pay more attention to figure out where the lines are being drawn or redrawn today. I can't tell exactly what's happening. I certainly am concerned about gentrification that could move out low-income people to make more space for high-income people. But I'd say that the best way to figure out how we got to where we are today is having a better sense of our history. You know, what are some of the patterns? What are some of the practices? What are some of the government policies that delivered us to where we are today, so that we can find a better way to live together and make this a better place for everyone involved. So I appreciate you bringing me in today and talking about some of the past history. I know it doesn't thrill everyone, but I think it's I appreciate people like you and others and some of your viewers here who are trying to figure out how we got here to carve out a better way for the future.
Well, I would like to say this to you personally. I appreciate that you have given us a snapshot of what really has taken place, and it kind of like dispels all the misinformation, the myths, and also the denials of how the American society has evolved into what it is today. But the fact of the matter is that one day we're all going to have to learn to live together, and whether it be on the east side of the river, on the west side of the river, or we all end up with cement ankle bracelets at the bottom of the river, somehow, some way, somebody has to get it in their heads that we have to exist together as a human race, not because I'm black, you're whatever ethnic or religious background you're from. We're just human beings, period. Plain and simple. People are just people. It seems like a very simple, spiritual type of what you might say a definition of what life is really all about. But unfortunately, people just can't keep it simple.
Well, Charles, thanks very much for inviting me to talk with you today.
It was my pleasure.